My own family drove me 12 hours into the wilderness, handed me a backpack and said, "See you never." What they didn't expect was for me to actually survive what they put me through. But here's what really haunts me. I think I know exactly why they wanted me gone. I should have known something was wrong when they smiled too wide at breakfast. My brother-in-law Jake kept refilling my coffee like I was about to run a marathon, and my sister Emma wouldn't stop asking if I'd told anyone where we were going. Of course I hadn't. Who was I gonna tell? My ex-wife who stopped returning my calls 3 months ago? My boss who'd been looking for reasons to fire me since I missed that client meeting? The friends who disappeared when the divorce papers got signed? They'd been planning this bonding trip for weeks ever since I showed up at Emma's door with 2 suitcases and what was left of my pride. "You need to get back to your roots," Jake had said, all earnest and concerned. "Remember when we used to go camping as kids?" Except we never went camping as kids. Jake grew up in suburbs where the wildest thing was a backyard barbecue gone wrong. The drive started normal enough. Classic rock on the radio, gas station coffee, Jake telling the same stories about his sales numbers that nobody asked to hear. But then Emma turned around from the passenger seat with this weird expression, half guilty, half excited, and asked for my backpack. Said something about wanting to organize the supplies better in the trunk. Made sense, right? Then my phone. "Better reception if we keep all the electronics together," she explained, holding out her hand like I was a kid turning in homework. The map request came last. My actual paper map, the one I'd marked with potential hiking trails and campsites because I'm old school like that, sue me. "We've got GPS." Jake laughed, but there was something sharp underneath it. "Don't worry, big guy. We know exactly where we're going." That's when I noticed we'd turned off the highway. No big deal, lots of good camping spots require back roads, but this road wasn't even marked. No signs, no mile markers, just gravel and pine trees getting thicker by the minute. The GPS on Jake's dashboard kept saying recalculating in that annoying robot voice until he finally turned it off completely. Well, things got interesting when I saw the altitude marker, 9,200 feet. My ears popped and suddenly breathing felt like sucking air through a straw. I'd been living at sea level for 2 years. My body wasn't ready for mountain air. "Jesus, Jake, where exactly are we going?" I asked, but he just cranked up the music and started drumming on the steering wheel. Emma was texting someone. Fast, urgent little taps on her phone screen. When I leaned forward to see, she angled it away like I was trying to cheat on a test. The weird part is, she just told me there was no reception up here. So who was she texting? And why did she keep glancing at me in the side mirror like I was about to figure out some big secret? The gravel road got narrower. Branches started scraping the sides of Jake's precious SUV, the one he usually wouldn't even take through a car wash that wasn't hand-detailed by professionals. But he kept driving, knuckles white on the steering wheel, jaw set like he was heading into battle instead of a family camping trip. Then the trees opened up into this clearing, middle of absolutely nowhere, surrounded by peaks I couldn't name and forest that stretched forever in every direction. Jake killed the engine, and the silence hit like a physical thing. No traffic, no neighbors, no civilization, just whined through pine needles and the tick of cooling metal. "This is perfect," Emma said, but she wouldn't look at me when she said it. She was already out of the car, moving with purpose toward the trunk. Jake followed, and suddenly they were both very busy unloading gear, everything except my stuff, I noticed. My backpack stayed put, so did my phone and my map. Back by Sunday, Jake called over his shoulder, and there was that smile again. The one that didn't reach his eyes. The one that made my stomach drop even before I understood what was happening. I heard my sister's voice, high and nervous, "It's for the best, really. You'll see." Then car doors slamming. The engine turning over, gravel crunching under tires that were definitely moving away from me, not toward a campsite. The sound faded until all that was left was wind and altitude, and the slow, cold realization that my own family had just dumped me in the middle of the Rocky Mountain wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back. But here's what they didn't know about their brilliant plan. I'd been preparing for this moment my whole life, just not the way they thought. You know what nobody tells you about being dumped in the wilderness? The moment that engine sound fades away, your brain starts doing this terrible math. And I mean terrible in every sense of the word. Both horrifying and pathetically simple arithmetic that a middle schooler could handle, but somehow feels impossible when you're standing there like an idiot at 9,200 feet. First equation hit me like a slap. Night temperatures drop 10 to 20 degrees for every 1,000 feet you climb. Makes sense, right? Well, I was already shivering in my thin jacket at what felt like 60 degrees during the day. That meant tonight, My first night abandoned by people who were supposed to love me could easily hit 30 or 40 degrees, maybe lower if the wind picked up, which it was already starting to do. The wind thing? That's where the math gets really ugly. See, I remembered reading somewhere that wind makes everything worse. Not just a little worse, exponentially worse. Something about wind chill and how your body loses heat faster when air keeps moving across your skin. Hypothermia doesn't need freezing temperatures to kill you. It can start working on you at 50 degrees if you're wet and there's wind involved. Standing there, I could feel my hands already getting stiff. That's when the panic math really kicked in. I started doing this frantic inventory of my pockets, which honestly felt like counting coins when you need to pay rent. Left pocket, a small folding knife that I'd forgotten about, thank God. Right pocket, a cheap plastic lighter that might have enough fuel for maybe 20 lights if I was lucky. Back pocket, a stick of gum and one loose shoelace from my boot that had been driving me crazy all week. That was it. That was my entire survival kit, courtesy of my loving family's little intervention. But here's the weird part. Once I accepted how screwed I was, my brain started working differently. Less panic, more problem solving. Maybe it was shock, or maybe desperation actually makes you smarter. I started looking around with new eyes, like I was seeing the forest for the first time. The wind was coming from the west, hitting me pretty hard on my left side. Basic logic said I needed to get out of that wind, or I'd lose body heat even faster. I walked around testing different spots, holding up my hand to feel air movement, found this decent-sized pine tree with low branches that created what felt like a natural windbreak on the eastern side. Then there's the insulation problem. My jacket was about as useful as tissue paper, but I remembered something from a camping trip years ago. Dead air space is what keeps you warm, not the material itself. I started gathering pine needles, the dry brown ones that had already fallen. Stuffed them inside my jacket, down my sleeves, anywhere I could create little pockets of trapped air. Did I look ridiculous? Absolutely. Did I care? Not even a little bit. The ground was already stealing heat from my body just from standing on it. I could feel the cold creeping up through my boots, so I made this makeshift mat using more pine needles and some dead branches, anything to create a barrier between me and that heat-sucking earth. While I worked, my mind kept cycling through more survival math. How long could I last without water? 3 days, maybe less at this altitude where you dehydrate faster. Food? Humans can go weeks without eating, but that's not really the issue when you're fighting hypothermia. Your body burns calories trying to stay warm, and I didn't have many calories to spare. The sun was already starting to sink lower, and I knew I had maybe 2 hours of decent light left. 2 hours to figure out water, fire, and better shelter, or I'd be doing all of this in the dark with nothing but a lighter that might die at any moment. What really got to me wasn't the physical stuff. It was realizing how completely they'd planned this. Taking my phone, my pack, even my map. They'd thought through every detail of leaving me helpless. The mathematical precision of their cruelty was almost impressive. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed I'd panic, make stupid decisions, maybe learn some kind of lesson about responsibility or whatever twisted logic they were following. Instead, they'd just pissed me off and activated every stubborn gene I'd inherited. Because here's what they didn't factor into their cold equations. I had something more powerful than gear or preparation. I had spite, and spite is an incredible motivator when you're trying not to die. The real math wasn't about temperature drops or wind chill. It was about proving them wrong, one calculated survival decision at a time. The first thing that hits you when you're dumped in the middle of nowhere isn't panic. It's thirst. My mouth was already dry from the stress, and I knew that feeling would only get worse. 3 days without water, that's what they say a human body can handle under normal conditions. But nothing about being abandoned at 9,200 feet in the mountains feels normal, and I wasn't about to test those limits. The altitude makes everything harder. Your body works overtime just to function, which means you're burning through water faster than usual. I could already feel it starting, that slight headache creeping in, the way my spit felt thick and useless. Dehydration kills you slowly. Then, all at once, first you get confused, then your organs start shutting down. Not exactly the way I planned to spend my weekend. I had to think like water. Sounds stupid, right? But that's what my old camping buddy used to say before he moved to Florida and left me to deal with family drama alone. Water always takes the path of least resistance, flowing downhill toward valleys and low spots. The terrain around me sloped gently to the east, so that's where I headed, stepping carefully through the pine needles and loose rocks. The forest was eerily quiet except for the occasional bird call and the sound of my boots crunching on dead leaves. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, hoping to catch the sound of running water. Nothing, just the wind through the trees and my own breathing, which was still too shallow and quick from the thin air. Then there's the fact that finding water is only half the battle. Mountain streams might look crystal clear and pure, like something out of a nature documentary, but they're often crawling with bacteria that'll make you wish you died of thirst instead. Giardia, E. coli, nasty stuff that turns your insides into a war zone. The last thing I needed was to survive being dumped by my loving family, only to die from explosive diarrhea 2 days later. After about an hour of careful hiking, I heard it, the faintest trickle of water somewhere ahead. My heart actually jumped. Pathetic how exciting the sound of dripping water becomes when your life depends on it. I followed the sound to a small seep where groundwater was bubbling up through the rocks and moss. It wasn't much, maybe a cup's worth pooling in a natural depression, but it was steady and clear. The weird part is how your priorities shift so fast. 2 hours earlier, I was worried about missing work on Monday. Now I'm staring at a puddle of water like it's liquid gold. I cupped some in my hands and smelled it first. No sulfur smell, no weird colors, no obvious signs of contamination. It looked good, but looking good and being safe are two very different things in the wilderness. Lucky for me, someone had used this spot as a campsite before. Scattered around the area were the remains of an old fire ring, and buried in the cold ashes, I found a dented tin can, probably left by some weekend warrior who didn't follow leave no trace principles, but their laziness was about to save my life. Makes you wonder about the butterfly effect, doesn't it? I cleaned the can as best I could with pine needles and a little water, then filled it from the seep. Building a fire with just a lighter and whatever I could scavenge took longer than I expected. Dry birch bark makes great tinder, but finding truly dry wood when you're stressed and your hands are shaking is harder than it sounds. The flame caught on my third try, and I carefully fed it twigs until I had something hot enough to boil water. Boiling kills most of the nasty stuff that could make me sick, but timing matters. A rolling boil for at least 3 minutes at this altitude. The thin air means water boils at a lower temperature, so you need extra time to make sure everything dies. I watched that can like my life depended on it, because it literally did. While the water cooled, I couldn't help thinking about the irony of it all. Here I was, using survival skills I'd learned from YouTube videos and camping trips, because the people who were supposed to care about me had decided I needed to figure things out the hard way. The water tasted like metal and pine needles, but it was the most satisfying drink I'd ever had. I buried the can in damp soil to cool it faster and marked the location of the seep with a pile of rocks. Water would be my lifeline for however long this nightmare lasted. But as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, I realized I had bigger problems coming. The temperature was already dropping, and I still didn't have fire or shelter figured out. I'll be honest with you, at that point, I wasn't thinking about rescue anymore. Well, maybe I was lying to myself, because the first thing I did was gather every piece of dry bark I could find, and let me tell you, birch bark is like nature's newspaper, peels right off in thin sheets that catch fire faster than gossip in a small town. My hands were shaking as I built that first real fire, not just from the cold, though the temperature was dropping fast as evening came on. I was shaking because this felt permanent somehow, like I was accepting that nobody was coming to get me anytime soon, and if they were, I'd better make it easy for them to find me. The teepee method works best for getting a fire started. Sounds fancy, but it's just stacking your kindling like you're building a tiny house. Birch bark goes in the center, then pencil-thin twigs, then thumb-thick ones, all leaning against each other. The fire needs to breathe, so you can't pack it tight like you're stuffing a turkey. Here's what nobody tells you about starting fires when you're desperate. Your lighter becomes the most precious thing in the world. Every click of that little wheel feels like you're gambling with your life. Because in a way, you are. I had maybe 30 good lights left in that cheap gas station lighter, and I needed to make each one count. The bark caught on the second try. Thank God, that little flame felt like victory and hope rolled into one tiny orange dance. But then came the real work. 3 puffs of smoke means distress. I learned that in Boy Scouts 20 years ago, back when I thought wilderness survival was just a fun game we played on weekends. Funny how knowledge sits in your brain waiting for the worst possible moment to become useful. I started feeding green leaves and damp pine needles into my fire, creating thick white smoke that rose straight up in the still air. The weird part is how good it felt to have a signal going out into the world, like I was finally fighting back instead of just surviving. Every few minutes, I'd smother the fire with green stuff, let the smoke build up thick and white, then pull it away to let the smoke shoot up in a column. 3 times. Rest. 3 times again. But smoke isn't enough, right? What if nobody's looking up at the sky? What if they're flying over but can't see through the tree canopy? That's when I remembered the clearing I'd passed about 100 yards back. Big enough to see from above, flat enough to work in. I took a burning branch as a torch and headed back there, keeping my fire alive at base camp by banking it with larger logs that would burn slow. Building an X with fallen logs sounds simple until you're doing it in the dark with numb fingers. Each log had to be thick enough to stand out from above, long enough to make a clear signal, and positioned just right so the whole thing looked intentional rather than random forest debris. I dragged dead branches that were heavier than I expected, my torch guttering in the wind every few steps. The whole time I'm thinking, what if this is all pointless? What if they're not even looking for me? What if this was never about survival training and more about, well, let's not go there? Not yet. Here's something crucial I learned that night. Lighter fuel doesn't last forever. Shocking revelation, I know. But when you're clicking that wheel every hour to restart your fire because you let it die down too much, you start doing math. 30 clicks becomes 20, becomes 15, becomes pure panic. That's when I discovered punk wood. Sounds like something teenagers would listen to, but it's actually rotted wood that's dry and fibrous inside. Burns slow and steady, holds an ember for hours. I found a piece of old birch trunk that was perfect, soft enough to scoop out a little bowl, dense enough to hold heat. So I made my first coal, blew on that tiny orange spot until my cheeks hurt, nursed it like a premature baby, carried it with me everywhere. Having fire you can transport changes everything. You're not trapped by the location of your last successful flame anymore. The signal fire burned through the night, but I kept it smart. 15 feet from my shelter, because forest fires start with overconfident campers who think they're smarter than physics. I'd learned enough hard lessons for one day without adding burn down my own survival shelter to the list. Morning would bring new problems, new decisions. But right then, watching my smoke signals rise into the star-filled sky, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. I felt like I might actually make it out of this thing alive. The question was, did I even want to anymore? You know that moment when you realize everything you thought you knew about camping was complete garbage? Yeah, that hit me harder than altitude sickness when I started looking for a place to sleep. All those car camping trips with the fancy tent and sleeping bags suddenly felt like playing house compared to this nightmare. The wind kept hammering me from every direction, and I'm standing there like an idiot trying to figure out which way it's actually coming from. Mountain winds are sneaky bastards. They bounce off rocks and trees, swirl around peaks, and basically laugh at your attempts to hide from them. But here's what I learned the hard way. There's always a leeward side. Always. You just have to think like the mountain instead of fighting it. I found this slope that felt calmer, where the wind wasn't trying to strip the skin off my face. The ground was softer too, covered in years of fallen leaves and pine needles. Perfect, right? Wrong. Soft ground means cold ground. And cold ground will suck the life out of you faster than you can say hypothermia. That's when I remembered something my grandfather told me years ago, back when I actually listened to his old school wisdom instead of rolling my eyes. He said shelter isn't about keeping the cold out, it's about keeping your heat in. Made sense, right? But understanding it and actually building it are two completely different animals. I started gathering branches, looking for one thick enough to be my ridgepole. My hands were already getting clumsy from the cold, and every stick I picked up felt heavier than it should. The altitude was messing with me more than I wanted to admit. Finally found a decent branch, about as long as I am tall, maybe a little longer. Propped one end against a tree trunk and the other end on the ground, creating this basic frame that looked pathetic but would have to do. Then came the ribs. Smaller branches leaning against the ridgepole on both sides, like building the skeleton of some primitive lean-to. The spacing mattered, too far apart, and the whole thing would collapse when I piled debris on top. Too close together and I'd run out of branches before finishing. Each decision felt life or death important because, well, it basically was. But here's where things got interesting. I needed insulation, and lots of it. Not just a thin layer like I'd use for a backyard fort. The rule I remembered from some survival show was simple. Insulation thickness should match the width of your arm. Sounds easy until you're scrambling around in the dark, gathering armloads of pine needles, dead leaves, and anything else that might trap air. My fingers were going numb, and I kept dropping half the debris I'd collected. The frustration was building. Why didn't they teach useful stuff like this in school instead of making us memorize dates of wars? Every handful of leaves that scattered in the wind felt like a small defeat. The weird part is how much stuff you actually need. I thought I'd gathered enough insulation 3 different times, but when I stepped back to look, the shelter still looked thin and pathetic. So I kept piling. Pine needles, dead grass, more leaves, anything that would create air pockets. The pile grew until it looked less like a shelter and more like a massive compost heap. Then there was the heat reflection trick. I'd seen this in a movie once, using rocks to bounce heat back into your space. Found some flat stones and arranged them in a half circle around where the opening would be. They'd absorb heat during the day and hopefully radiate some back at night. Every little advantage mattered when you're betting your life on a pile of sticks and leaves. The entrance had to face away from the wind, but still let me see out. I wanted to know if anything was coming to investigate my new home. Bears, mountain lions, or worse, people looking to finish what they started. I kept the opening just big enough to crawl through. Bigger meant more heat loss, and I was already fighting a losing battle against the cold. My boots were getting wet from the snow and damp ground, so I decided they'd come inside with me. Frozen boots in the morning would mean frostbite before noon. I'd sleep with them in my jacket, using body heat to keep them from turning into ice blocks. As I crawled into my debris hut for the first time, testing the space and feeling branches poke into my back, one thought kept nagging at me. This shelter might keep me alive tonight, but what about tomorrow night? And the night after that? The real test wasn't just surviving one cold mountain evening. The challenge was staying hidden long enough to figure out my next move, because morning would bring new problems I wasn't ready to face. By day 3, I knew staying put wasn't working anymore. The smoke signals felt like screaming into a void, and my little shelter was turning into a prison of false hope. My food situation was getting desperate. I'd found some edible berries and inner bark, but my stomach was starting to eat itself. The reality hit me hard. Nobody was coming. At least not fast enough. Moving in the wilderness without getting completely screwed is an art form most people never learn. And honestly, I was making it up as I went along, trying to remember every survival show I'd ever half-watched while eating pizza on my couch. The sun became my compass, which sounds romantic until you realize how easy it is to mess up. Everyone knows it rises in the east and sets in the west, right? Well, here's what they don't tell you. The sun doesn't just pop straight up like a toaster. It arcs across the sky, and depending on the season, that arc shifts north or south. But the basic rule saved my ass. Morning sun on my right meant I was heading north, which felt like the right direction towards civilization. Then there's the shadow trick that actually works. I stuck a straight branch in the ground and marked where its shadow ended with a rock. Waited about 15 minutes, felt like an hour when you're starving, and marked the shadow's new position. Drew a line between those 2 rocks, and boom, that line runs east to west. The first mark is west. The second is east. Simple physics, but it felt like magic when you're lost. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. Mountains have their own twisted logic when it comes to navigation. I learned about contour thinking the hard way. Basically, ridges are your friends and gullies are death traps. When a storm hits, and they always hit in the afternoons up there, water rushes down those gullies like a freight train. Ridges might be windier, but they're safer. Plus, you can actually see where you're going, instead of stumbling around in a green tunnel of confusion. The marking system I developed probably looked insane to any wildlife watching me. Every 50 steps, and I counted obsessively because panic makes you stupid, I'd break off a piece of bark or snap a branch in a specific way. Always at eye level, always pointing back toward where I came from. My breadcrumb trail of bark flakes became my lifeline. Without it, I would have walked in circles until I collapsed. Makes sense, right? But then I hit my first real obstacle, a creek that looked innocent but was running fast and cold enough to kill me if I screwed up the crossing. The water was maybe thigh deep, but the current was strong and the rocks were slippery as hell. This is where people die in the mountains, not from bears or lightning, but from stupid mistakes around water. I remembered something about river crossings from somewhere. Unbuckle your pack completely so if you fall, you can ditch it instead of drowning. Face upstream so you can see what's coming at you. Find a thick stick to use as a third leg for stability. Shuffle your feet instead of taking big steps. The water was so cold it felt like needles, and I was shaking before I even made it halfway across. Well, the stick technique worked. Barely. I made it across looking like a hypothermic penguin, but I made it. Then spent the next 20 minutes doing jumping jacks to get feeling back in my legs. The timing thing became crucial as I got more tired and desperate. Rest breaks sound optional when you're comfortable, but they're literally life-saving when you're running on fumes. 10 minutes every hour, no matter how urgent everything felt. Exhaustion makes you sloppy, and sloppy gets you dead in the wilderness. During those breaks, I'd force myself to really look around, check my bark markers, and make sure I wasn't doing anything completely idiotic. And the weird part is, this methodical approach started working. I wasn't just stumbling around anymore, I was actually covering ground in a deliberate direction. The terrain started changing, becoming less vertical and hostile. I began seeing signs of human activity, old trail blazes, the occasional piece of litter that felt like treasure. But the real breakthrough was still coming. The moment that would either save my life or prove that all this careful navigation was just elaborate procrastination before dying alone in the mountains. Because moving smart is only half the battle when you're fighting for survival, I thought I was getting pretty good at this whole survival thing. You know? Fire under control, shelter built, water sorted out. Then the first night came, and let me tell you something, the mountains don't care about your confidence. They've got their own rules, and breaking them can kill you fast. The wind hit around midnight like a freight train made of ice. I'm talking about gusts that made my little debris hut shake like a dog toy. But here's the thing nobody tells you about mountain weather, it's not just cold that gets you, it's how fast everything changes. 1 minute you're comfortable, the next you're shivering so hard you can't think straight. Wet skin loses heat 25 times faster when there's wind involved. 25 times, that's not a typo. Your body becomes a heat-bleeding machine. I learned this the hard way when my jacket got damp from melted snow. The wind turned that moisture into a death sentence I had to fight off by stuffing more pine needles inside my clothes and hugging that reflected heat from my rock wall. Smart move, building those rocks earlier. Sometimes you get lucky with your own planning. Then there's the wildlife situation. Makes sense, right? You're in their house now. I stored my food, what little I had, about 200 feet from my shelter. Not because I'm some kind of expert, but because every camping story that ends badly starts with, and then the bear got into our food. Black bears mostly avoid people, but they're curious about smells. Clean camp, make noise, don't be stupid. The basics work if you follow them. But the weird part is how quiet it gets between the wind gusts. Dead silent, like the world stopped breathing. That's when you hear every twig snap, every rustle in the bushes. Your imagination goes wild. Was that a bear? A mountain lion? Probably just a squirrel, but at 3 in the morning when you're already on edge, that squirrel sounds like a monster. Well, around dawn on day 2, I got my first real weather lesson. Mountain storms build fast. And I mean stupid fast. 1 minute you've got clear skies, the next you're watching dark clouds roll over the peaks like someone pulled a curtain across the sun. Afternoon storms are the worst. They come out of nowhere and hit like hammers. Lightning became my biggest worry. Up here, you're already closer to the action, and metal objects turn into death magnets. I ditched anything metallic and stayed away from lone trees and ridgelines. There's this old trick for measuring how close lightning is: count the seconds between the flash and thunder, then divide by 5. Each 5 seconds equals about 1 mile. When I started counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and barely got to 3 before the thunder cracked, I knew I was in trouble. Let's not forget that altitude makes everything harder. Your body's working overtime just to function normally. Less oxygen means you get tired faster, think slower, make dumber decisions. Dehydration hits quicker too. I was drinking way more water than I expected, which meant more trips to find and purify it. The strangest thing happened on day 3. I woke up to find tracks around my camp. Not bear tracks, something smaller but definitely not human. Probably foxes or coyotes checking me out while I slept. They'd kept their distance, but knowing they were there watching me sleep, that messes with your head. You start wondering what else is out there, what other eyes are watching from the tree line, and the cold. Jesus, the cold at night. Even with all my insulation tricks, my body heat couldn't keep up. I kept my boots inside my sleeping area because frozen boots in the morning mean frostbite waiting to happen. I learned to rotate positions every hour or so, keeping blood flowing to my fingers and toes. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself with a brass band, it sneaks up on you, makes you confused and sleepy right when you need to be sharpest. Day 3 brought sleet. Not snow, not rain, that nasty in-between stuff that soaks through everything and then freezes. I spent most of that day maintaining my fire and trying to keep dry clothes dry. The ember trick saved my butt. I'd been carrying a small piece of punk wood with a live coal inside, keeping my fire alive even when the weather tried to kill it. The mountains were testing me, throwing everything they had at my little survival setup. Each challenge felt like a pop quiz where the wrong answer could mean not making it home. But here's what I was starting to figure out: the weather and wildlife weren't my biggest enemies. My own panic was: stay calm, stick to the basics, and don't make stupid decisions when you're scared or cold. That's easier said than done when you're counting lightning strikes and listening to things move around your camp at night. By day 4, though, something had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was adapting. Day 4 started like a fever dream breaking. I woke up shivering so hard my teeth were chattering like castanets, and for a split second I couldn't remember where I was. Then reality hit me like a cold slap. I was still here, still abandoned, still very much on my own in this god-forsaken wilderness. My joints felt like they'd been dipped in concrete overnight. The morning sun felt different, though. Warmer, maybe, or maybe I was just getting desperate enough to imagine things. Either way, I knew I couldn't stay put another day. My body was starting to feel wrong, sluggish in ways that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I packed up what little I had, which wasn't much, and started moving. The plan was simple: find higher ground, look for any sign of civilization, and keep my eyes peeled for anything that looked man-made. Roads, power lines, smoke from chimneys. Anything that screamed people live here and they have hot coffee. About 2 hours into my hike, I hit what looked like a game trail. Nothing fancy, just a narrow path where animals had worn down the brush over time. But here's the thing about game trails: they usually lead somewhere useful. Water, food sources, or in my case, hopefully something that connected to human activity. The trail wound through dense pine forest for what felt like hours. My legs were starting to feel like jello, and I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. The altitude was still kicking my butt, even after 4 days. Well, I kept telling myself it was the altitude and not the fact that I'd been living on pine needle tea and sheer stubbornness. Then I saw it. Fresh tire tracks in mud. I literally dropped to my knees and touched the ruts like they were made of gold. The tread marks were crisp, recent, maybe from yesterday or the day before. This wasn't some old logging road that hadn't seen traffic since the Clinton administration. This was real, active, beautiful human civilization. The tire tracks led to what I can only describe as the most gorgeous service road I'd ever seen in my life. Gravel, relatively well maintained, and it actually went somewhere instead of just ending in a pile of rocks and disappointment. I could have kissed that road, but here's where my brain started working again. What if whoever dropped me off came back this way? What if I walked right into them? The paranoid part of me, which was running pretty hot after 4 days alone, started spinning worst-case scenarios. Then the rational part kicked in and reminded me I was probably going to die out here if I didn't take the chance. I left an arrow made of stones pointing back toward my camp, scratched my name into the dirt with a stick, and started following those tire tracks like they were breadcrumbs leading me home. Every step felt like progress, like I was finally doing something other than just surviving. About a mile down the road, I heard it. The most beautiful sound in the world. An engine. A truck engine, getting closer. I started waving my arms like an inflatable tube man at a car dealership. I pulled out that old tin can I'd been using to boil water and angled it to catch the sun, flashing it like a signal mirror. Probably looked completely insane, but I didn't care. This was my ticket out. The Ranger truck, because of course it was a Ranger truck like some kind of perfect movie ending, pulled up next to me. The guy behind the wheel looked at me like I'd just dropped out of a UFO. Matted hair, clothes that smelled like campfire and desperation, probably talking too fast and too loud because I hadn't heard another human voice in 4 days. He radioed for backup, gave me water that tasted like liquid heaven, and wrapped me in one of those space blankets that crinkle like chip bags. The ride to the ranger station was a blur of questions I couldn't really answer and explanations that sounded crazy even to me. At the medical station, the doctor said I had mild hypothermia. Nothing life-threatening, but my core temperature had dropped enough to affect my thinking. She explained the rewarming process, slow and steady with blankets, not the hot shower I was craving. Apparently shocking your system with heat can actually make things worse. Who knew? The weird part is, I never called them afterward. You know who I mean. The people who thought 4 days in the mountains would teach me some kind of lesson. Instead, I spent weeks learning every trail, every back road, every way in and out of that forest. Knowledge they never had and never would. But that's not even the strangest part of what happened next.